The rain fell in steady sheets over New York City, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon and streetlight. Inside velvet and ivory, the air was warm, dry, and thick with the low hum of conversation, clinking glasses and the soft, melancholic notes of a piano playing in the corner. It wasn't a concert, just background music, the kind meant to soothe wallets more than souls. The pianist, an older man with silver hair and tired eyes, played standards, Gershwin, Porter, a little Ellington. Pleasant, polished, forgettable. Near the bar, a young woman moved quietly between tables, balancing a tray with practiced ease. She wore a black dress that had seen too many shifts, a white apron tied neatly at her waist, and sensible shoes that had long lost their shine. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands escaping to frame a face that held more exhaustion than expression. She didn't smile much, not because she was unfriendly, but because smiling took energy she didn't have to spare. Her name wasn't on anyone's lips tonight. To the guests, she was just the waitress, invisible, efficient, part of the furniture. But if you'd watched her closely, really watched, you might have noticed something else. Every time the pianist paused between songs, her eyes flicked toward the grand piano like it was calling to her. Not with longing exactly, but with something deeper. Recognition. Like seeing an old friend across a crowded room. Once, when a guest dropped a fork and it clattered near the piano bench, she flinched. Not at the noise, but at the thought of someone carelessly bumping the instrument. She knew what those keys could do. She knew what they meant. Years ago, she'd sat at a piano just like that one. Not in a bar, but in a sunlit practice room with tall windows and walls lined with sheet music. Back then, her fingers had danced across the keys for hours, chasing perfection, chasing beauty. She'd been accepted into one of the most respected music schools in the country, on full scholarship. Teachers had called her gifted, rare, destined. She believed them. She believed in the music the way some people believe in prayer. Then her mother got sick. The medical bills came faster than the diagnoses. Insurance covered some, but not enough. Not nearly enough. She tried to juggle school and part-time work, but the hours didn't add up. One night, after a particularly grueling shift at a diner, she fell asleep over her Chopin etudes. The next morning, she missed her masterclass. The professor wasn't angry, just disappointed. That look hurt more than shouting ever could. She dropped out a week later. Now she worked 6 nights a week at Velvet and Ivory, serving overpriced whiskey and truffle fries to people who barely noticed her. She lived in a tiny apartment in Queens with her mother, who was better now, stable even, but the debt remained like a shadow. Every tip she earned went toward rent, groceries, and the slow grinding repayment of hospital bills. There was no room for dreams in that equation. Music became something she tucked away, like a photograph she couldn't bear to throw out but couldn't look at either. Tonight, the bar was busier than usual. A private event had taken over the back half of the room. 8 tables pushed together, crystal glasses, linen napkins, the kind of gathering where deals were made over dessert. The host was a man in his late 40s, sharp suit, sharper smile. He carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. He laughed loudly, clapped people on the back, ordered bottles of wine without glancing at the price. His guests, mostly men in similar suits, a few women in elegant dresses, nodded along, laughing at his jokes a beat too quickly. He'd been watching the Waitress for a while, not in a creepy way, at least, not yet, but with the idle curiosity of someone who assumes the world exists for his entertainment. He noticed how she moved, smooth, quiet, never spilling, never rushing. He noticed how she avoided eye contact, how she kept her head slightly down. And he noticed how twice during the evening, her gaze had drifted to the piano like it was pulling her in. During a lull in the conversation, right after the main course had been cleared, he raised his hand slightly. Not a wave, just a flick of 2 fingers. She saw it and approached, tray held low at her side. "Yes, sir? Can I get you anything else?" He leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You work here often?" "Most nights," she said simply. "You ever play that piano over there?" She blinked. "No, sir. I'm just staff. But you look like you know how." She hesitated. "I used to." "Used to?" He grinned as if he'd uncovered a secret. "Well, why don't you play something for us? Just one song." "We're celebrating." She shook her head gently. I really shouldn't. I'm on the clock and the pianist is taking a break, he interrupted, nodding toward the empty bench. Come on, it'll be fun. Consider it part of the service. Her stomach tightened. She glanced toward the bar, hoping the manager might intervene, but he was deep in conversation with a supplier. The other servers were busy. She was alone. I'm not dressed for it, she said, gesturing to her uniform. And I haven't played in a long time, so? He shrugged. It's just a song. What's the harm? The table watched her now. Some looked amused, others indifferent. One woman gave her a small, sympathetic smile, but said nothing. She wanted to say no. She wanted to walk away. But she thought of the rent due next week. She thought of her mother's medication. And she thought of the way this man's tone had shifted from curious to commanding. Saying no might mean a complaint, a bad tip, maybe even being written up. She took a breath. If I do, will you leave a fair tip for the whole team? Not just me? He laughed as if she'd made a joke. Sure, play something good and I'll make it worth your while. That wasn't a promise. It was a dare. She set her tray down on a nearby empty table, her hand steady despite the tremor inside her chest. She smoothed her apron, adjusted the bun at the back of her head, and walked toward the piano. The room didn't go silent, not yet, but the chatter softened, like people sensing something unusual was about to happen. She sat on the bench. It was cool under her hands, familiar. The keys gleamed under the soft lights, ivory and ebony, waiting. She hadn't touched a real piano in over 2 years. Her fingers hovered, uncertain. What could she play? Something simple?
A pop song?
But that felt wrong. This wasn't a party trick. If she was going to do this, if she was going to expose this part of herself to strangers, she wouldn't cheapen it. She closed her eyes and then she began. Not with fanfare. Not with showmanship. Just a single clear note that hung in the air like a question. Then another. And another. Slowly, gently, the opening of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room. It wasn't perfect. Her fingers were stiff from dishwater and carrying trays. There was a slight hesitation in the left hand where muscle memory had faded. But none of that mattered, because what came through wasn't technique, it was feeling. Every note carried the weight of everything she'd lost, everything she'd buried. The loneliness of late-night shifts, the ache of unplayed music, the quiet pride of showing up day after day, even when hope felt thin. The man who'd asked her to play stopped smiling. The clinking of ice in glasses ceased. A woman at the next table set down her fork, her eyes wide. The older pianist, who'd been watching from the shadows near the bar, stood very still. The music swelled, not loud but deep. It wrapped around the room like a warm, sad blanket. People who'd been scrolling on their phones looked up. Waiters paused mid-step. Even the bartender stopped polishing glasses. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to. She was back in that sunlit practice room. She was 16 again, playing for her mother on a Sunday afternoon. She was whole. When the final chord faded, soft, unresolved, lingering, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of awe, full of respect, full of something no one in that room had expected to feel in a place like this. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Not the man who demanded the performance. Not at first. It was the woman who'd given her that small smile earlier. Then another guest joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, not politely but genuinely, warmly, like they'd just witnessed something rare and real. She opened her eyes. Her hands rested on the keys, trembling now for a different reason. She stood quickly, smoothing her dress, avoiding everyone's gaze. She walked back to her tray, picked it up, and forced herself to keep moving. Back to work, back to being invisible. But something had shifted. The man who'd asked her to play stared at his glass, his expression unreadable. He didn't clap. He didn't call out a compliment. He just sat there as if the music had knocked something loose inside him. She didn't know it yet, but that one song, played under pressure, played out of necessity, had just changed everything. Not because of the billionaire's whim, but because she'd refused to let her gift be reduced to a party trick. She'd played it true, and in doing so, she'd reminded everyone in that room, including herself, that some things can't be bought, coerced, or ignored. Not even in a city that never sleeps. Not even in a bar where dreams go to die. Especially not then. The applause faded slowly, like the last notes of the nocturne still echoing in the walls. She kept her eyes down, focused on the tray in her hands as if it held the only thing that mattered in the world. Her heart pounded, not from nerves anymore, but from something deeper, something raw. She'd just opened a door she'd kept locked for years, and now she didn't know how to close it again. She walked high to the service station, her steps quiet on the plush carpet. One of the other servers, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver streaks in her hair, gave her a look that said, "I saw that. I know what that cost you." She didn't say anything, just handed her a fresh stack of napkins and nodded toward table 7. A silent thank you, a silent understanding. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. She refilled water glasses, cleared dessert plates, offered coffee with a voice that sounded steady, even though her hands still trembled slightly. No one mentioned the piano, not directly, but she felt it, the shift in the air, the way people glanced at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Some with admiration, some with curiosity, a few with that uncomfortable mix of guilt and awe that comes when you realize someone you've been treating as background noise has a whole inner world you never bothered to see. The man who'd asked her to play didn't call her over again. He stayed quiet for the rest of the evening, sipping his drink slowly, staring into space like he was replaying the music in his head. When the bill came, he paid in cash, more than enough to cover the whole table, plus a tip so large it made the manager blink twice. He didn't say a word to her as he left, just a brief, almost awkward nod as he passed by the bar. She told herself it was over. Just one strange night. One moment of weakness, or maybe strength. She wasn't sure yet. Either way, it was done. She'd go home, kiss her mother goodnight, fall into bed, and tomorrow would be like any other day. Early alarm, subway ride, uniform pressed, head down, work hard, survive. But life rarely lets go that easily. The next evening, she arrived at Velvet and Ivory, 10 minutes early, as always. She changed into her uniform in the cramped staff bathroom, checked her hair, took a deep breath. Routine was her armor. But the moment she stepped onto the floor, she felt it. The buzz. 2 regulars at the bar were talking in low voices, glancing toward the piano. "Heard she used to study at Juilliard," one said. "No way," the other replied. "She's just a waitress." "Then how do you explain last night?" She kept walking, pretending not to hear, but her cheeks burned. Later, during the dinner rush, a woman in a designer coat stopped her near the entrance. "You're the one who played Chopin last night, right?" she asked, eyes bright. "It was breathtaking. Are you performing again soon?" "I'm not a performer," she said gently. "I just played once." "But you should," the woman insisted. "People need to hear that." She thanked her and moved on, but the words stuck. People need to hear that. Did they? Or was it just polite flattery from someone who'd had a little too much wine? Then, halfway through her shift, the manager pulled her aside near the wine cellar. He was a practical man in his 60s, balding with a permanent coffee stain on his vest. He'd hired her 2 years ago after a 5-minute interview and a handshake. He'd never asked about her past, never pried. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "That guy from last night, he called." Her stomach dropped. "The one who asked me to play?" "Yeah. Left his number. Said he wants to talk to you. Didn't say why." He paused, studying her face. "You okay?" "You don't have to call him. I told him you're staff, not entertainment." She nodded quickly. "Thanks, I appreciate that." But after her shift ended, as she walked home through the damp city streets, the thought wouldn't leave her. Why would he call? To apologize? To offer more money? To ask for another performance like it was a magic trick she could pull out of her sleeve on command? She didn't call him that night. Or the next. But on the 3rd evening, as she sat at the kitchen table helping her mother sort through medical bills, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe dread, made her answer. Hello? A man's voice, calm this time. Not loud, not commanding. Hi, I hope I'm not bothering you. It's the guy from Velvet and Ivory from Thursday. She went still. Her mother looked up, sensing the shift. I just wanted to say, what you played, it stayed with me. More than I expected. He paused. I've been thinking about it all week. She didn't know what to say. Thank you, she finally offered. I also wanted to apologize, he continued. The way I asked you to play, it wasn't right. I treated you like part of the decor. And you're not. You're an artist. She blinked. No one had called her that in years, not seriously, not without irony. I'm not really, she started. You are, he cut in gently. And I'd like to make it up to you, not with money, not as a tip, but as support, if you're open to it. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. What do you mean? She asked carefully. I know you had to leave school, he said. I did a little digging, not much, just enough. I saw the scholarship, the gap in your timeline. I get it. Life happens. He took a breath. I'd like to help you go back. Full tuition, living expenses, no strings, no interviews, no publicity. Just a chance. Her throat tightened. It sounded too good to be true. And in her experience, things that sounded too good usually came with hidden costs. Why? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do that? Another pause. Longer this time. Because I spent most of my life believing talent is something you buy or control, he said slowly. Last Thursday you reminded me it's something you honor, and I owe you that much. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She thanked him, ended the call, and sat there in the dim kitchen light, staring at the phone like it might bite her. Her mother didn't ask for details. She just made tea and set a steaming mug in front of her. Whatever it is, she said softly, you don't have to decide tonight. But the seed was planted. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Not just the offer, but the feeling of sitting at that piano again. The way her fingers had remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The way the music had risen up inside her like it had been waiting all along. She called her old professor. The woman answered on the third ring, voice warm with surprise. I've been wondering about you, she said. How are you holding up? They talked for nearly an hour. About her mother. About the bills. About the years lost. And then, hesitantly, she mentioned the offer. There was a long silence on the other end. It's not unheard of, her professor finally said. Patrons have supported students before, but you have to be careful. Make sure it's real. Make sure it's about you, not about his ego. I don't even know him, she admitted. Then meet him, the professor said. On your terms, in public. Ask hard questions, and trust your gut. You've always had good instincts, so she agreed to meet him. Not at a fancy restaurant, not at his office, at a quiet cafe near the public library, neutral ground, daylight, people around. She wore her best non-uniform outfit, dark jeans, a simple blouse, her hair loose for once. She arrived 10 minutes early and sat by the window watching the street. He showed up exactly on time, no entourage, no flashy car. Just a man in a plain coat, carrying a paper cup of coffee. He looked different in daylight, less polished, more human. Tired even. He sat across from her. Thanks for coming, she nodded. I have questions. Ask them. Is this really no strings? She said, cutting straight to it. Because I've been burned before. People say they want to help, but they really want something in return. Attention, gratitude, control. He met her eyes. I want nothing from you, not your time, not your thanks, not your music. If you say no, I'll walk away and never mention it again. If you say yes, I'll handle everything quietly. You focus on your studies. That's it. Why me? She pressed. There are hundreds of talented musicians who need help. Because I saw what happens when talent gets buried under survival, he said quietly. And I realized I've spent my life building things that don't last. Companies, deals, headlines. But what you played, that lasts. And you deserve to give it room to grow. She studied him. No smugness, no performance, just sincerity. What if I fail? She asked, the real fear finally out in the open. What if I've been away too long? What if I'm not good enough anymore? He smiled faintly. Then you tried. And that's more than most people ever do. They talked for another hour. About music, about New York, about second chances. He didn't ask for her life story. Didn't pry. Just listened. And for the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a waitress, not as a charity case, but as a person with a past, a present, and maybe, just maybe, a future. When they parted, he handed her a plain envelope. No decision needed today, he said. But if you ever want to go back, this has the contact for the school's re-enrollment office, and my direct line. No pressure. She took it. The paper felt light, but it carried the weight of 1,000 possibilities. That night she didn't sleep. She sat on the fire escape of her apartment, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the piano at Velvet and Ivory. She thought about her mother's smile when she'd hummed a Chopin melody while cooking dinner last week. She thought about the silence after she'd finished playing, the kind of silence that meant people were truly listening. And she realized something. She hadn't played for him. She hadn't played for the room. She'd played for herself. And that was the part no one could take away. The next morning, she called the number in the envelope. Not to accept. Not yet. But to ask about the re-enrollment process. Because maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Maybe the music hadn't left her after all. Maybe it had just been, waiting for her to come back. The first day back at the music school felt like stepping into a dream she wasn't sure she was allowed to have. The building hadn't changed much. Same tall windows, same worn wooden floors that echoed with the sound of scales and arpeggios drifting from practice rooms. But she felt different, older, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. She wore the same simple clothes she always did, jeans, a soft sweater, her hair pulled back. But this time, she wasn't hiding. She walked through the front doors with her acceptance letter in her bag, and her heart hammering like it was her first recital all over again. A few students passed her in the hallway, eyes flicking over her with polite curiosity. No one recognized her. Why would they? She hadn't been here in years. To them, she was just another new face, maybe a transfer, maybe a late starter. They didn't know she'd once been the girl professors whispered about in hallways. The one with unusual sensitivity and rare touch. She found her assigned practice room on the 3rd floor, small, windowless but with a decent upright piano that had seen better days. She closed the door behind her, leaned against it, and just breathed. The silence here wasn't empty like the silence of her apartment at night. It was full of potential. Full of waiting notes, she sat on the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys. For a moment, fear gripped her. The old fear that she'd forgotten everything, that the magic was gone, that she'd wasted this second chance before it even began. But then she pressed down on middle C. Just one note. Warm, solid, real. And just like that, her hands remembered. She started slow, Hanon exercises, then Czerny, then simple Bach inventions. Her fingers were stiff at first, clumsy in places where they used to glide, but muscle memory is a stubborn thing. It doesn't vanish. It just sleeps, and hers was waking up. Over the next few weeks, she fell into a rhythm unlike any she'd known in years. Mornings began with coffee and theory homework at the kitchen table, while her mother sorted mail. Then the subway ride downtown, headphones on, listening to recordings of Horowitz, Argerich, Rubinstein, not to copy, but to remember what was possible. Afternoons were filled with classes, harmony, ear training, music history. Evenings were for practice, 3 hours minimum, sometimes more if the room was free. She was behind. Of course she was. Students half her age could sight-read pieces she'd struggle with for days. But she had something they didn't. Life, grief, resilience. And when she played, it showed. Not in flashy technique, but in the spaces between the notes, the breaths, the pauses, the way a phrase could ache with something words couldn't say. Her professor, the same woman who'd taught her years ago, met with her once a week. She never mentioned the gap in her education. Never said, "You should have been here all along." Instead, she asked questions like, "What do you hear in this passage?" Or, "Where does the sadness live in this chord?" She treated her not as a comeback story, but as a musician, flawed, growing, worthy. One rainy Tuesday, after a particularly tough session on a listitude, her professor leaned back in her chair and said, "You're not trying to prove anything anymore, are you?" She looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You used to play like you were chasing approval," the older woman said gently. "Now you play like you're coming home." She didn't answer. But later, walking back to the subway, she realized it was true. She wasn't playing to impress judges or win competitions or even to repay the person who'd made this possible. She was playing because the music had never really left her. It had just been waiting for her to stop running. Still, it wasn't all easy. Money was tight, even with the support she'd been given. The arrangement was simple. Tuition covered, a modest monthly stipend for living expenses, paid directly to her bank account with no fanfare. No interviews. No photo ops. Just quiet, consistent help. She never saw the person who arranged it. They exchanged a few brief emails, mostly logistical, but that was it. And she was grateful for the distance. It kept things clean, human, but pride was harder to manage than bills. One afternoon, she ran into an old classmate in the hallway, a guy who'd graduated while she was working double shifts at a diner. He smiled when he saw her. "Hey, I heard you were back." "That's great." But his eyes held a flicker of something else, pity, judgment, she couldn't tell. Later, she overheard him telling someone, "She dropped out when things got hard. Now she's trying to pick up where she left off." Brave, I guess. It stung. Not because it was untrue, but because it reduced everything she'd survived to a single sentence. As if her mother's illness, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing their apartment, none of it mattered. As if coming back wasn't courage, just convenience. That night, she almost quit. She sat at the piano in her tiny apartment, the second-hand one she'd bought with her first stipend payment, and stared at the keys. What was the point? Maybe she didn't belong here anymore. Maybe she was fooling herself. But then her mother came in carrying 2 mugs of tea. She didn't say anything. Just set one down on the piano lid and sat on the couch, knitting like she always did when her daughter practiced. That simple act, the quiet presence, the unspoken belief, anchored her. She played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major again. Not for an audience, not for validation, just for them. For the woman who'd sacrificed everything so she could have a chance. For the girl she used to be. For the woman she was becoming. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. As the semester wore on, small things began to shift. She started making friends. Not the kind who gossiped in hallways, but the kind who stayed late to help her with counterpoint. Who shared sheet music, who listened when she played and said, "Try it softer here, it'll break more hearts that way." She performed in a student recital, a modest event in a small hall, mostly attended by other students and a few professors. She chose a piece by Clara Schumann, something tender and strong. Her hands shook as she walked on stage, but once she sat down, the fear melted away. She played with everything she had. Not perfectly, but honestly. Afterward, a first-year student came up to her, eyes wide. "How do you make it sound like it's talking?" she asked. She smiled. "You listen first, then you answer." The biggest test came near the end of the term. The school announced a guest masterclass with a world-renowned pianist, a woman known for her sharp critiques and even sharper ear. Students signed up weeks in advance. She almost didn't. But her professor encouraged her. "You're ready," she said. "Not because you're flawless, because you have something to say." The day of the masterclass, the room was packed. She sat in the back, heart in her throat as others played, fast, clean, technically brilliant. Then her name was called. She walked to the grand piano on the stage, aware of every eye on her. The guest artist sat in the front row, expression unreadable. She chose the same Chopin Nocturne she'd played that night at the bar, not for nostalgia, but because it was hers. It carried her story. She played. Halfway through, she missed a note, a small stumble in the left hand. In the old days, that would have shattered her. But this time she didn't stop. She kept going, letting the music flow around the mistake like a river around a stone. And something strange happened. The room leaned in. The guest artist's stern expression softened. When she finished, there was silence. Then slow, deliberate applause from the front row. The pianist stood and walked to the stage. "Tell me," she said, "why did you choose this piece?" "Because it's the first thing I played when I came back," she answered, voice quiet but steady. "It reminded me that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being present." The woman nodded. "That's rare. Most students play to impress. You played to connect." She turned to the audience. "Remember this. Technique can be taught. But truth? That has to be lived." After the class, several students came up to talk. Not to compare, not to compete, but to thank her. "You made me remember why I started," one said. That night she didn't go straight home. She walked through the city. The spring air cool on her face, the sounds of traffic and distant laughter blending into a kind of urban symphony. She thought about the bar, the coercion, the fear, and how none of that defined what came after. What mattered was what she'd done with the chance she'd been given. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. She still wore the same worn shoes and drank cheap coffee. But something inside her had settled. She belonged not because someone said so, but because she'd earned her place, note by note, day by day. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not as a waitress who played piano, not as a charity case, but as a musician, flawed, human, and finally fully herself. The months passed like pages turning in a well-worn book, quietly, steadily, filled with small moments that added up to something real. She settled into her new rhythm. Early mornings with coffee and sheet music, afternoons in lecture halls or practice rooms, evenings walking home through streets that no longer felt like a maze of survival, but a familiar path. Her mother's health held steady, and for the first time in years, their apartment didn't feel like a place they were barely holding on to. It felt like a home again. She still thought about that night at the piano bar, but not with shame or anger anymore. It had become a kind of origin story, not the beginning of her talent, but the moment it refused to stay buried. And though she never saw the person who'd made her return possible, she felt his presence in the quiet reliability of her monthly stipend, in the clean sheet music that arrived in the mail every few weeks with no note, just her name on the envelope. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, she got an email, short, simple, no fanfare. "I'll be in the city next week. If you're open to it, I'd like to hear you play, just once, in a real setting. No audience. No pressure. Only if you're comfortable." She read it 3 times. Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't performing for him. She wasn't his project. But then she thought about it differently. This wasn't a demand. It was a request. And it came with space, with respect. He wasn't asking her to prove anything. He just wanted to listen. She wrote back, "There's a small recital hall near campus. I have a student performance there next Thursday. You're welcome to come. Back row. No one will know you're there." He replied within an hour, "Thank you. I'll be there." The week leading up to the recital was tense, not because she doubted her playing, but because part of her still braced for judgment. Old habits die hard. She practiced more than usual, not to impress, but to feel ready. Her chosen piece this time was Beethoven's Piano Sonata, No. 14 Rear, the Moonlight, not the flashy third movement, but the haunting first, slow, deep, full of shadows and light. The night of the performance, the hall was modest, maybe 50 seats, half filled with fellow students, a few professors, and a handful of curious locals. She wore a simple black dress, the same one she'd worn to her first class back. No makeup, no pretense, just her and the music. She walked on stage, nodded to the small audience, and sat at the piano. For a moment she scanned the back row, and there he was. Not in a suit, not surrounded by assistants, just a man in a dark coat sitting alone, hands folded in his lap. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just met her eyes and gave the tiniest nod. And somehow that was enough. She began. The first notes of the moonlight floated into the room like mist over water, soft, steady, endless. She played not for him, not for the crowd, but for the silence between heartbeats, for the years she'd spent believing she'd lost her voice. Her fingers moved with a calm she hadn't known she possessed. The music wasn't perfect. There was a slight hesitation in the transition to the second theme, but it was true. And truth, she'd learned, mattered more than perfection. When she finished, the applause was warm but quiet, the kind that comes after something intimate. She stood, bowed slightly, and walked off stage without looking back. Back in the green room, a closet-sized space with a folding chair and a pitcher of water, she sat and waited, heart still humming with the echo of the final chord. 10 minutes later, a soft knock came at the door. She opened it. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking smaller than she remembered. "That was more than I expected," he said quietly. "You've grown." "I had help," she replied. He shook his head. "I didn't give you talent. I just cleared a little space for it to breathe." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them, the coercion, the apology, the trust slowly rebuilt. "I came to say thank you," he finally said. "Not for playing. For reminding me that some things can't be bought. That real value isn't in what you own, but in what you protect." She looked at him, really looked. She saw the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a quiet weariness. He wasn't the arrogant man from the bar anymore. He was someone changed, just as she was. "I also came to ask something," he continued. "Would you be open to helping me do something different?" She raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I've been thinking a lot about access," he said. "About how many people like you, talented, driven, capable, get shut out because life gets in the way. Bills, family, bad luck. I used to think success was about who wanted it most. Now I know it's about who gets the chance." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to start a small fund. Not flashy, no press. Just direct support for students in music, dance, writing, any art, who have to choose between their gift and their survival. Full tuition. Living costs. Mental health support if they need it. No strings. No repayment." He looked at her. "But I don't want to do it alone. I want someone who's lived it to help shape it, to make sure it's real. Would you consider advising the program? Just a few hours a month. You'd have full say in who gets help." She was stunned. "You want me to help decide who gets a second chance? Like I got?" "Exactly," he said. "Because you'll know what to look for. Not just skill, but heart, resilience. The kind of fire that doesn't go out even when it's buried." She didn't answer right away. She thought about the students she'd met, brilliant, struggling, working night shifts just to afford subway fare to class. She thought about the girl she used to be sitting in a hospital waiting room, wondering if she'd ever touch a piano again. "Yes," she said finally, "but only if it stays quiet, no names. No stories sold to the media. The help should be about them, not about you, not about me." He smiled, a real one this time. That was always the plan. They talked for another 20 minutes about structure, about privacy, about how to find the people who needed it most. He took notes, listened, asked questions. It didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like collaboration. Before he left, he handed her a plain envelope. "This isn't money," he said. "It's a letter to the school. I've set up an endowment in your name, but it won't be announced. Not ever. It'll just be there quietly for whoever comes next." She didn't open it. She didn't need to. "Thank you," she said. "But don't name it after me." "Why not?" "Because this isn't about me," she said gently. "It's about the next person who sits at a piano in a bar and wonders if they still have a song left." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll call it the Second Chance Fund." She liked that. After he left, she walked home alone through the cool night air. The city felt different, not less harsh, but less lonely. She thought about the students who would one day receive help they didn't have to beg for. She thought about the quiet dignity of being seen, believed in, given room to grow. Back at her apartment, her mother was waiting with tea and a slice of apple pie from the bakery down the street. "How'd it go?" she asked. She sat at the table, wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Good," she said. Really good. She didn't tell her everything, not yet. But she told her enough. That someone who'd once made her feel small had helped her stand tall, and now they were trying to do the same for others. Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "I'm not done," she replied, and she meant it. Over the next few weeks, She met with the school's administration to formalize the details of the fund. She insisted on anonymity for recipients, on flexibility, because life doesn't follow a neat schedule. One student might need help with childcare, another with therapy, another with just a few months of rent so they could stop working double shifts. The fund would adapt. She also began mentoring a first-year pianist, a young woman from a rural town who'd never seen a grand piano until her audition. She reminded her so much of herself, nervous, gifted, afraid she didn't belong. They met once a week, not just to work on technique, but to talk. About fear, about worth, about how art isn't a luxury, it's a lifeline. One rainy afternoon, as they sat in a practice room, the student looked up and said, "How did you keep going when everything was falling apart?" She thought for a moment. "I didn't think about the whole mountain," she said. "Just the next step. One note, one day, one breath." The student nodded, eyes bright. "I'm going to remember that." That night, as she walked home, she passed a street musician playing an old upright piano someone had left on the sidewalk. His fingers were chapped, his coat thin, but he played with joy. Simple folk tunes, a little jazz, a bit of Bach. People dropped coins in his open case, but he didn't play for the money. He played because he had to. She stopped and listened for a while. Then she dropped a 20 in the case, not out of pity, but kinship. He looked up and smiled. "Thanks. You're good," she said. He shrugged. "Music's the only thing that's never let me down." She nodded. "Yes, I know what you mean." As she walked away, she realized something. Her story wasn't special because of the billionaire or the bar or the second chance. It was special because it was human. Because it was about showing up even when you're tired. About saying yes to hope even when it's scary. About passing the light forward when you finally find it. And that, more than any performance, any fund, any title, was what mattered. She wasn't just rebuilding her own life anymore. She was helping build a world where others wouldn't have to lose theirs to begin with. The recital hall wasn't grand. It sat tucked between a bookstore and a bakery on a quiet side street. The kind of place you'd walk past without noticing unless you were looking for it. Inside, the walls were pale wood, the seats worn but comfortable, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and rosin. There was no red carpet, no flashing cameras, no crowd of critics. Just a small stage, a well-cared-for Steinway, and about 40 people, friends, teachers, a few curious neighbors, and one man sitting alone in the very back row, coat collar turned up slightly, eyes fixed on the empty bench. She stood in the wings, not nervous but calm. Her hands were warm, her breathing steady. She wore the same black dress she'd worn to her first student performance months ago, but it felt different now. Not like armor, but like something familiar. Like an old friend. She wasn't here to prove anything. She wasn't here for fame or validation or even gratitude. She was here because the music asked her to come, and this time she was ready to listen. A year had passed since that night at the piano bar. A year of early mornings, late nights, missed buses, small victories, and quiet doubts. A year of rebuilding, not just her technique, but her belief that she belonged in rooms like this. She'd performed in student recitals, played for community events, even accompanied a local choir during the holidays. Nothing flashy, nothing viral, just music shared honestly, and through it all, the fund she'd helped shape had quietly grown. 5 students were now supported, 2 pianists, a violinist, a poet, and a dancer from the Bronx who worked nights at a laundromat. None of them knew who'd made it possible. None of them needed to. What mattered was that they could breathe, that they could practice without wondering how they'd pay for groceries, that they could dream without shame. She stepped onto the stage. A few people smiled. Her mother sat in the 3rd row, hands folded in her lap, eyes bright. Her old professor gave her a small nod from the aisle seat. And in the back, the man who'd once demanded a performance now sat with his hands resting gently on his knees, as if holding space rather than expecting something in return. She sat at the piano. The wood was cool under her palms. She closed her eyes for just a second, not to block out the room but to center herself in the silence before the sound. Then she began. She didn't choose Chopin this time. Not Beethoven either. She played a piece by Florence Price, a composer long overlooked now being rediscovered. It was lyrical, rich with gospel harmonies and classical form, full of sorrow and resilience. It felt right, not because it was difficult, but because it carried a story of being unseen, of creating beauty anyway, of refusing to be erased. Her fingers moved with a kind of quiet confidence she hadn't known before. Not showy, not perfect, but present. Every note had weight. Every pause had meaning. She wasn't playing to impress the room. She was playing to honor the journey, the late-night shifts, the hospital bills, the fear, the hope, the unexpected kindness that had changed everything. Halfway through, she forgot the audience existed. She forgot the back row. She forgot everything except the conversation between her hands and the keys. The music rose and fell like breath. At one point, a single tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't stop. She let it fall, let it be part of the song. When the final chord faded into the air, the silence that followed wasn't the stunned hush of that first night at the bar. It was deeper, softer, like the room itself was holding its breath out of respect. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Not loudly, not for show, but warmly, genuinely. The kind of applause that says, "I heard you. I saw you. Thank you." She stood, bowed slightly, and walked off stage without looking back. In the small hallway behind the stage, her mother was waiting. She didn't say anything, just opened her arms. They held each other for a long moment, the kind of hug that carries years of worry, pride, and love all at once. "You played like you were free," her mother whispered. "I am," she replied. Later, as the audience trickled out chatting quietly, sipping tea from paper cups, the man from the back row lingered near the exit. He didn't approach her, didn't try to speak. He simply stood by the coat rack, watching as students congratulated her, as her professor patted her shoulder, as a young girl, maybe 12, with braids and wide eyes, hesitantly asked for her autograph on a program. He smiled faintly at that. Then, just as the hall emptied, he turned and walked out into the evening. She saw him go from the doorway. She could have called out, could have thanked him again, but she didn't. Some things don't need words. Some debts aren't paid, they're passed forward, and he knew that now just as she did. Over the next few weeks, life returned to its rhythm, but a different kind of rhythm. One that included teaching a weekly workshop at a community center, where kids from housing projects learned to read music on donated keyboards. One that included late-night calls with the poet in the fund, who was struggling with writer's block but kept showing up anyway. One that included quiet mornings at the piano, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She still worked part-time, not as a waitress, but as an assistant at the music school's library. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept her close to the world she loved. And on slow afternoons when no one was around, she'd sit at the old upright in the corner and play, just for herself, just for the joy of it. One Saturday, she visited the bar where it all began. Velvet and ivory looked the same dim lights, same plush booth, same grand piano in the corner. The current pianist was a young man with a shaved head and a gentle touch, playing Bill Evans with quiet reverence. She ordered a club soda and sat at the bar, not as staff, not as a guest, just as someone passing through. The manager recognized her immediately. "Well, look at you," he said, pouring her drink with a grin. "Heard you're back in the game." "Something like that," she said. He leaned in. "You know that guy, the one who caused all that trouble, he came in last month. Sat right where you are. Didn't order anything fancy. Just listened to the piano for an hour, then left a $100 tip and walked out." She smiled. "People change." "Yeah," he said, wiping the bar. "Sometimes they do." She stayed for one drink, then left. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city hummed around her. Taxis honking, people laughing, a saxophone drifting from an open window down the block. It was messy, loud, imperfect, and beautiful. She didn't become famous. No record deals, no world tours, but she didn't need to. Her music found its home in smaller places, in practice rooms, in community halls, in the hearts of students who now believed they, too, could have a second chance. And the man who'd once used his power to demand a performance? He never sought credit, never gave interviews. But quietly, year after year, the fund grew. More students, more disciplines, more lives given room to breathe. He'd started it out of guilt, maybe, but he kept it going out of something deeper, respect. Years later, when she was teaching a master class at a small college in upstate New York, a student asked her, "What's the most important thing you've learned about music?" She thought for a moment. "That it's not about being the best," she said. "It's about being honest." And that sometimes the most powerful note isn't the loudest, it's the one that says, "I'm still here." The student nodded, scribbling in her notebook. After class, as she packed her bag, she found a note slipped under the piano lid. Just 2 words written in neat handwriting. "Thank you." She didn't know who left it. Maybe a student. Maybe someone who'd heard her story. Maybe no one important at all. But she tucked it into her coat pocket anyway. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Not the coercion, not the fame, not even the second chance. It was about the quiet moments of connection. The shared silence after a song. The hand that reaches out when you think you're alone. The courage to play even when no one's listening. And the grace to keep playing, even after they do. She walked out into the autumn afternoon. The sun warm on her face, the sound of distant practice rooms echoing behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The music was already inside her, and it always would be.